Welcome back to Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality more than just skin deep. I'm Enzi, your host, and this week we will be discussing Black Wall Street and the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. Let's get it started. I was in 5th grade when Timothy McVeigh bombed the Oklahoma Federal Building. I remember this particularly because that was the year myself and my siblings were supposed to go with my auntie to her job at the Kansas City Federal State Building for Bring Your Child to Work Day. This year was canceled because of the bombing in Oklahoma. I don't remember who my school year teacher was that year, which is odd because I remember the names of most of my teachers from grade school. But what I do remember is while discussing the Oklahoma City bombing, my teacher said something that I thought was odd. She said that that was not the first time a bombing on that scale has occurred in Oklahoma. And she proceeded to say that not only was that not the first time, it was not the most deadliest. And that is when I learned about the Tulsa Massacre for the very first time. I don't remember exactly what was said. I could try to make up stories or bring up other understandings of what was said, but I don't know exactly. That was 26 years ago. So time has changed. My understanding has changed. But I went to a Catholic school from preschool to 8th grade. This was not just a normal, regular Catholic school. See, Kansas City, Missouri, at that time and still is one of the most segregated cities in the nation. So that Catholic school I went to was an all-black school. I got an education unlike any other. The value of that education, I am not quite sure if I understood until the summer of 2020, when the uprisings was at its height. Realizing that the knowledge and the information I had around Black history exceeded that of my peers. But not just that. See, I have a passion and a joy and learn a lot about Black history. I research it. I study it. I read about it. When I was a child, I read Black history books for fun during the summertime. And so I hadn't thought much about it. But what I realized is my peers from grade school and my siblings, they also knew a lot more. See, we also learned about Rosewood and other tragic events. I don't want to focus, though, too much on the Tulsa Massacre because we often talk about this in a negative sense, and it was a very negative event. But we don't talk about Black Wall Street enough. We don't talk about the innovation and the joy. And so I want to kind of juxtapose the two. I want to talk about, as much as possible, the ways in which Black Wall Street took decades to build. Decades. See, 1921 means that those folks, that's less than 40 years after the end of slavery. And we have a community who worked really hard to build something that was destroyed and burnt down to the ground. I would encourage you, if you can, to do research into the Greenwood community of Tulsa, Oklahoma from 1921. We have seen more and more mentions of the Tulsa Massacre in media, in TV shows like Watchmen and shows like Lovecraft Country. And I think that is an incredible representation of the pain and horror and trauma that has happened. And our story, the story of Black Americans, does not begin with pain. Our story does not begin with slavery. Likewise, the Greenwood community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, did not just begin with the Tulsa Massacre. And here's the thing about the Tulsa Massacre. It was not just about the events that supposedly happened the night before. It is much more. It is about a cycle of destruction enacted by white communities onto black communities. See, Tulsa was extreme and was not unique, not even during that time period. I'm going to name Rosewood. If you've not heard about the city of Rosewood in Florida, look it up. That was another massacre. And the numbers like that, we don't quite know. But as you're listening to this, they are still digging up the bodies of those burned in the Tulsa Massacre. We're not going to know the numbers. We're not going to have the information. And the question is, how do we continue to allow ourselves to not know history, to not know events that has occurred? I want to discuss an article that I read in the forward this week. The article was called "The Tulsa Massacre Wasn't a Race Riot. It was a pogrom." 100 years ago, a pogrom destroyed a community. A pogrom is, according to John Killer, who was the subject's leading authority and author of numerous seminal studies on Russian Jews, an outbreak of mass violence directed against a minority, religious, ethnic, or social group. It usually implies central instigation and control, or at minimum, the passivity of local authorities. In this program, which lasted barely 24 hours, some 300 men, women, and children were murdered in cold blood. 1,500 homes and businesses were burned down, and the entire community that took decades to build was destroyed. Planes fired from the sky and may have even dropped bombs. As so often happened, the surviving victims, rather than perpetrators, were arrested and blamed. Insurance companies refused to pay out on policies, and survivors had no choice but to leave or try to rebuild on the site of their destruction. As I read this article, these words, I may come back to other aspects of the article before we finish, but I was struck by this incredibly painful and yet succinctly accurate description of the events that occurred that night. And what made it worse is the attempt to cover up what happened. This was an event that has been denied for decades that it even happened. And for those who admitted that it happened, denied and continue to deny the severity in which it occurred. How do we heal from an event that happened that is denied, that folks do not believe it ever happened? See, when we talk about uprisings and riots and burning down buildings, those are very important conversations. And the thing about how we talk about modern history is we oftentimes neglect, or perhaps it is a much more sinister thing, and those that were in power made a conscious decision to make sure that enough of the population did not know the truth, did not know this way in which our government, this way in which our cities, this way in which our police departments and sheriffs have historically and still continue to attempt to control our communities. The ways in which when things happen, when trauma happens, when negative things happen, the ways in which those in power try to cover up and sweep away the things that happened. The thing about Tulsa is that many of those citizens, the white citizens, were deputized. The thing that cannot be forgotten about Tulsa is many of the black men were war veterans. They fought and risked their lives to come home and to be slaughtered like chattel. And perhaps those who were doing the slaughtering still considered them no different than chattel slavery. Who knows? What we do know is we will never get back what was lost, what was burned, and what can never be rebuilt. And so I want to end this with making this statement. I've heard this statement many times, which is the question of, why can't the black community do X, Y, and Z? Why can't they get ahead, get advanced? But see, the thing is, as Tulsa Massacre points out, whenever the black community attempted to get ahead, it was burned to the ground. It was bombed. And we will discuss some of these other events on different episodes. We will not this whole show will not be a painful show on tragedy after tragedy. It will be a show about joy and love, because intersectionality is not just about pain and marginalized identities. It's about joy and liberation. See, for me, identifying is about honoring who you are and how we live and how we exist in the world. So, how will this information change you? What will you do with the knowledge of what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago? The Tulsa Massacre is referred by many names. The Tulsa Massacre, the Black Wall Street Massacre, and most commonly it is referred to as the Tulsa Race Riots. But as mentioned in the foreword, which I'm going to read a part of that article again, that is an inadequate term. When he says, these events are often called race riots, but this is a misnomer that suggests some sort of West Side Story battle of rival ethnic gangs. They were pogroms. They were violent attacks by mobs of the majority race ethnicity who, secure in the support of acquaintances of the state, attacked black communities with impunity, murdering, raping, and destroying their property and homes. The Tulsa violence, like many lynchings and pogroms, was sparked by an accusation of rape, a sort of blood libel based on the myth of black lust for white women. That black men have been so horrifically murdered in public spectacle for raping, quote, our women, end quote, is tragically ironic, considering the rape of black women by whites has been so systematic for so many centuries that recent genetic studies have estimated that on average, well over 20% of African American DNA today is European. So what can we do with this knowledge? of the Tulsa Massacre, of the Tulsa pogrom. We learn about it. We study about it. We refuse to be quiet about it. We refuse to allow for this piece of history to be forgotten. Because as Jews, we are really good at marking time. And this is one incident that we do not want to forget to mark, because this is a tragic piece of our history in the United States that we must constantly be reminded of in order for us to not return to such an event again. But even more than that, I believe that we have the ability and the power to constantly call out and demand reparations when it is needed and when it is called for. In this situation, I strongly believe, well, in general, I believe in reparations, but in this situation, the residents of Tulsa, those folks, the descendants of Greenwood community, those who lost everything from Black Wall Street, deserves and should be demanding reparations. Our next episode, we will be hearing from the program coordinator at J Pride, Mira Graham, and we will be discussing all things Pride. I look forward to chatting with y'all then. Until next time. Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality, more than just getting deep, is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. You can email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com/podcast.